Right, lovely. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar that outlines the findings from our recently released report, Understanding Social Entrepreneurs in South Africa, Experiences, Gaps and Opportunities. My name is Steve McCullum. I'm a project manager for the Innovative Finance team at the Bertha Center for Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and I will be hosting the webinar this afternoon. If you haven't seen the report already that the Innovative Finance team at the Bertha Center in partnership with the SAB Foundation have put together, please have a look at the Bertha Center's website under research. We'll also be dropping that link in the chat shortly. I'll ask Zach to do that for us as we go along. Just to give you a quick overview of where we are heading for today's webinar, Bridget Evans, the Executive Director of the SAB Foundation, will just be introducing the purpose of the research and why we actually undertook it. Then I'll be joined by my colleagues, Zach and Calvin, to give you an overview of the findings from the report. And then we have a really inspiring panel of 3 social entrepreneurs, and we'll be unpacking some of their experiences behind it. They had actually joined us as part of the survey, and it's just fantastic to have them now actually sharing that in person as well. And then right at the end, we'll have a brief time for Q&A. Bridget Evans and my former colleague, Tina Fisker-Henriksen, conceptualized the idea and the purpose to this research a while ago. So before we dive into the details behind the findings, Bridget, would you mind introducing us to the why of this study?
Sure. Thank you, Steve, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. It's great to see so many participants. I think myself and Tina have been talking for many years now about the challenges that we've seen in the early stage funding space in South Africa, particularly around social innovation. As many of you may know, SAB Foundation has funded social innovation at these early stages for a number of years. I think this is our 11th year of funding. And, you know, we started to encounter this challenge where we are sort of almost giving birth to a lot of these organizations where we are the first funder. And a lot of our time and energy is then taken up looking for the next opportunity or the next finance round for these entrepreneurs. And we really started to discover that despite there being so much rhetoric around the importance of social innovation, both in South Africa and around the world, there really is a gap in finance. We perceived that there was a big gap in finance, but what we realized is that perhaps that gap wasn't real. We knew anecdotally that there was a gap, but we really wanted to understand it more. And we really wanted to hear from entrepreneurs who are actually the early stage funders. Are we wrong in our perception that there is a gap? And then in terms of how they're able to raise finance, are they then having to go overseas to access that finance, or are they finding it locally? And really, we were hoping to use the research to try and better understand it, and also to then make a case for social innovation to funding and finance providers, whether they're in the public sector, the private sector, or in investment companies, to say there is this incredible spirit of innovation happening in South Africa. We've seen, and that innovation could play a significant role in addressing some of South Africa's socioeconomic challenges. However, they are hitting this wall in terms of their ability to access finance. So we felt that instead of us going out and telling people there was a gap, we would rather hear from entrepreneurs themselves, for them to be able to tell us exactly what the challenges are, so that we can actually see where the opportunities are. So we really hope that this, I think we had 160 entrepreneurs that completed this study for us. And if you were one of the participants, thank you so much. This kind of research is really important. And we're really hoping to use this as part of a bigger amount of research that various parties are undertaking in the country to create a much more enabling environment for social innovation, to be able to get through that, they call it the valley of death, so that we can start scaling this innovation and really addressing some of the critical challenges in the country.
Thanks so much, Bridget. I'm joined by my colleagues, Zach and Calvin, who are the authors of this report and consultants to the Bertha Center, and we'll be unpacking the main findings that we came across. As Bridget highlighted, that while an early stage funding gap, especially for social entrepreneurs, is anecdotally acknowledged, there's been little research into it in a South African context, and especially from the perspective of social entrepreneurs. So what we set out to do is really highlight those experiences from a social entrepreneur's perspective. So we surveyed 162 social entrepreneurs across South Africa, and we really wanted to understand the demographics, the education, impact goals, their business models, what's under the hood, what are their strategies, what are the barriers when raising funding, what are their experiences when raising it through different instruments, and what are their future prospects, what are they thinking about, and from that try and find where are the big gaps and opportunities that we can put out into the market. So I think a lot of you on this call would agree with me that small businesses are essential to the development of the South African economy as drivers of economic growth and employment. More than this, SMMEs, smaller businesses, hold the key to fair transition. And social entrepreneurs specifically aim to innovate and create value by incorporating social and environmental elements into their business models. So in a country that faces the triple challenge of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, the growth of social entrepreneurs is extremely important. But the reality that we found is that raising startup funding from friends, family, or using your own savings over a longer period of time is not really an option for many social entrepreneurs in South Africa. Social enterprises operate in resource-constrained contexts and deploy novel and innovative business models and strategies and use various technologies to do that. This sometimes amplifies the perceived and actual risks of investing in these businesses. The social entrepreneurs also indicate that the funding landscape is complicated and it's fragmented, and they actually aren't clear on who has funding available and who doesn't. And all this actually results in a mismatch between demand and supply. The research highlights that there are very small amounts of capital available in South Africa for earlier stage social enterprises, especially at smaller ticket sizes, confirming what Bridget had perceived. And globally, there's only 2% of impact capital goes to ticket sizes under $1 million, so roughly 14 million Rand, which is a very small amount. To put this issue into perspective, in our sample, 70% of the social enterprises that we interviewed, they've only raised 1 million Rand since inception. And that actually has largely come through grants, competition, or friends and family. And when we investigated their plans for future fundraising, 2/3 or 66%, as you'll see on the slide, are aiming to raise under 3 million Rand in their next round. This is fairly evenly split between ticket sizes of 100,000 to 500,000 Rand, 500,000 to 1 million Rand, and 1 million Rand to 3 million Rand. So all falling right under that 2% bracket. Now, if you also include the 12% of social entrepreneurs in our sample that are looking for a ticket size of 3 to 5 million Rand and consider those limited capital flows, you can see there's a major need, but also an opportunity for more early stage funding or an early stage fund. And yes, the challenges around that are apparent given the costs and risks, but there's also growing evidence around the use of some of the innovative financing toolkits to address some of those risks and costs, which Zach will highlight in a bit. So over to you, Zach.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Steve. And hello, everyone. Happy Tuesday. Thank you so much for being with us here today. I hope that all of you are safe and well. And it's so wonderful to share this virtual space with all of you. So as Steve just showed and Bridget just mentioned, there's a good amount of evidence in our own research and by studies by organizations like the World Bank and the Global Impact Investing Network that show an early stage funding gap. But we wanted to understand the intricacies of how this gap is experienced as a social entrepreneur. So we split the social entrepreneurs we surveyed into two categories. We defined those that raised over R1 million as effective fundraisers and those raised under R1 million as constrained fundraisers. And then controlling for things like the age of the business, location, etc. We wanted to see what the gaps and bottlenecks are within this early stage funding gap. And so a lot of these findings are somewhat expected, but still important to take into account when designing solutions like an early stage fund, as to what Steve mentioned. So first, we see that technology companies are much more likely to be effective fundraisers. In fact, 94% of effective fundraisers in our sample use technology as their main offering or to augment their offering. The type of business model a social enterprise deploys also correlates strongly with the amount of funding they raise. So social enterprises that use direct consumer models or cross-subsidization models are more likely to be constrained fundraisers. There's also evidence that social entrepreneurs that have more work experience or have the privilege of working in their businesses full-time are more likely to be effective fundraisers. Outside of this, there are also structural barriers. More educated social entrepreneurs are more likely to be effective fundraisers. And a gender and racial lens also exists that we'll unpack a bit later. So aside from understanding the barriers to raising large amounts of capital, we also want to understand how existing types of funding is allocated. So at an early stage, the most common way for social enterprises to finance their operations, like Steve mentioned, is through their own savings, grant capital, or competition funding. And these are relatively small amounts of capital. So in our sample, half of all entrepreneurs have raised grant funding. Many of these entrepreneurs also raise grant funding specifically from competitions. And so this indicates to us that grant funding and competition funding are very important to validate early stage ventures. We also ask the entrepreneurs what issues they faced when trying to raise grant funding or competition capital. And here it seems that information barriers or the amount of time it takes were the biggest challenges facing social entrepreneurs. Now, when we look at equity, debt, and international funding, which is usually much larger in terms of investment size, this picture changes significantly. So less than 15% of businesses in our sample have raised debt or equity funding. There also seems to be a notable gender and racial lens to this. So only 1 out of 5 of the entrepreneurs we interviewed who raised equity are women, and less than 1/3 are Black. The barriers that were mentioned to raising debt and equity funding were also much different compared to grants. So instead of information and time-related challenges, the largest issues facing social enterprises raising larger ticket sizes is not knowing how to raise equity funding or not being able to find anyone to invest debt into the business. When turning to international funding, we found that very few businesses at an early stage have international investors. Only 12.5% of businesses that have raised under 500,000 Rand have done so internationally. However, for larger ticket sizes, international investment seems vital. 3/4 of businesses that have raised over 5 million Rand have done so internationally. And when asked about their biggest barrier, they mentioned that it's a lack of understanding of the local context. And so all of this seems to indicate that the local ecosystem is struggling to build a bridge of early stage funding between ideation capital and growth capital. So this leads quite nicely into our next gap, which is the financial instrument gap. The minority of businesses that are able to raise debt to equity indicate that traditional financing instruments are not always suitable for their businesses. And among the social entrepreneurs we interviewed, there's also little awareness of financial instruments outside of their little kid who keeps shredding paper, and his parents take him to all different kinds of specialists to get him to stop shredding paper. And then finally, they take him to the most expensive doctor in the world. And the doctor says to the kid, kid, if you stop shredding paper, your parents will stop taking you to specialists. And the kid turns to his parents and says, well, why didn't you just say so? And I sometimes feel that it's the same when investing into social enterprises with traditional financing instruments. Investment funds and social enterprises sometimes try to fit their investment mandates or business models to financial instruments rather than making financial instruments fit their processes. And so there are a few ways that investing in social enterprises is very different from investing into traditional companies. So in our research, we found that most social entrepreneurs reported that their cash flow is inconsistent or seasonal. The social entrepreneurs we interviewed also use a variety of business models, from cross-subsidization to service delivery models. All of this makes traditional instruments like a loan really hard to work. There's also an additional layer of risk for investment funds when investing into social entrepreneurs. For those using equity, for instance, there's often no clear path to exit. Some social entrepreneurs are registered as non-profits, which makes taking equity stakes impossible, while others function in industries where there's little precedent. Also take both a financial and social impact risk when investing into social enterprises. The latter, however, is rarely included in the way we structure financial instruments. And so using traditional financing instruments like loans and equity is often like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. There's a big opportunity here for investors to open up a new toolbox of instruments that fit better. By using new financial instruments that are self-liquidating, take into account uncertain cash flows, and include social impact, a whole new world of investable opportunities open. Steve, but back to you.
Thanks, Zach. And as Zach pointed out earlier, there are some interesting findings on the topic of racial and gender lens investments in the research. To provide a bit of context, 48% of enterprises in our sample were owned by women. This is a narrower gender gap when compared to your pure for-profit SMMEs, where women are estimated to own only 38% of those businesses. In our sample, Black South Africans make up roughly 51% of the social enterprise owners, while white South Africans own about 37% of the enterprises. This is notably different to the demographics of pure profit-focused SMMEs in the country, where Black ownership is roughly around 76%. We found evidence that there remains to be a racial and gender lens gap for larger ticket sizes and non-grant funding, where women and Black social entrepreneurs remain underinvested in. In our sample, only 37% of the social entrepreneurs that raised over 1 million Rand were women. When looking at the instruments, women have been less successful using those which allow for bigger ticket sizes, where only 22% and 36% of equity and debt, respectively, were raised by women. Although Black social entrepreneurs fared well when winning grants and competitions, the data revealed that they were more constrained with instruments that allow for bigger ticket sizes. So with all this being said, what the major challenge is here is that this can inhibit and constrain growth capacity due to the low ticket size nature of grant and competition funding. Increasingly though, funds with gender and racial lenses are being established and building track records of investment. But there is a need for more focus around these issues at smaller ticket sizes. The growing evidence suggests that a portfolio of more diverse project owners generates better profitability and therefore has the potential to deliver attractive returns. So there remains to be an opportunity that's untapped around the racial and gender lens investment perspectives. Over to you, Calvin.
Great, thanks, Steve. And thank you so much for everyone that's joined us here today. I'll now discuss the impact measurement gap. So social impact measurement aims to assess the social value produced by the operations of an organization. And this is particularly important in the social enterprise context. Social entrepreneurs find creative and sustainable ways to address challenges confronting society, for instance, supporting vulnerable people, promoting education, or protecting the environment. And measuring impact is the way in which a social enterprise can demonstrate exactly how it is delivering on its mission. Impact is increasingly important for investors, and it is proving to be something that cannot be ignored. For social enterprises looking to access funding, getting ahead by measuring relative impact is essential in order to stand out in the crowd in a competitive bidding process. Investors increasingly seek both financial and social return for their investments. However, social impact is often very contextual, and many of the social enterprises that we surveyed indicated that they did not have a formal approach to impact measurement. And although there was a desire to learn and improve, many of the social entrepreneurs indicated that they did not know how to go about implementing a formal impact measurement strategy. We found that a quarter of the social entrepreneurs that we surveyed are not measuring their impact, and although 75% are, they are using their own metrics to do so. Social impact measurement is not standardized among the social entrepreneurs in our sample, and there is a lack of technical know-how and resources. Consequently, there's a disconnect between outputs, outcomes, and impact. For early stage investments, fund managers should help guide and support social enterprises on their impact measurement journey by taking an active role in assisting social enterprises to measure their impact and providing resources to establish effective monitoring and evaluation strategies. A social organization's mission and purpose are central to their very existence. So having definitive proof of how you're achieving your aims is crucial. The question is not whether social enterprises should measure their impact, but how to help them do this as effectively and efficiently as possible. Okay, and now I'll quickly run through the accessibility gap. Thanks, Steve. So while challenges are abundant for social enterprises, early stage enterprises specifically face even bigger hurdles, and a lack of financing options is a major constraint to their growth. Social enterprises need to access funding in order to grow and scale. And although there are many different types of capital available, as Zach mentioned earlier, many of these options are not suitable for the unique situation and needs of social enterprises. And the options that are suitable are often hard to access. And to make matters worse, this challenge is intensified in remote regions where social enterprises are further distanced from potential investors, despite these areas demonstrating the most pressing needs. A lack of networks was the most significant challenge to raising funding noted by the social entrepreneurs in our sample. The social entrepreneurs that we surveyed indicated that the funding landscape in South Africa is complex and fragmented. They said that it is not clear who has suitable funding options available, and it is also time-consuming to search for funding options whilst trying to grow the business and keep up with daily operations. Based on the experiences of the social entrepreneurs, there appears to be a general lack of understanding and poor communication from gatekeepers. Funding is more difficult for early stage enterprises that don't have a long track record. And although grants and competitions are important sources of finance, when it comes to scaling and growth, there's a need for bigger pots of money to step in to support these entrepreneurs. This presents investors with an opportunity to address this gap in the markets. Investors should try to make themselves more accessible to social entrepreneurs, improving access, especially to those that have the potential to scale, but lack the necessary resources to do so. It is important to understand the unique situation that these social entrepreneurs find themselves in, and to help promising social entrepreneurs acquire the resources that they need to succeed. This presents an opportunity not only for the social enterprises, but also for the investors looking to tap into the potential that these enterprises have to offer. Hey, thank you so much, and back over to you, Steve.
Thanks so much, Calvin and Zach. And once again, you are welcome to access the findings of the report. It's not a heavy read. We tried to make it as light a read as possible, and that's available. The link was put in the chat by Zach, and it's about a 30-page report. So for those of you who were wondering as well, we will send the recording and the slides out in the following week. Fantastic. It really is a privilege to invite Elmarie, Nikki, and Chad to come and share some of their experiences. They were respondents to the survey as well. So thank you so much for being involved at that level, but then also joining us today for this panel discussion. Before we jump into your experiences, will each of you start by sharing a 1-minute overview of your businesses? Let's start with Almarie, then we can go to Nikki, and finally Chad.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much for the opportunity. I'm standing in for Tuli today. I'll do my best Tuli impersonation. Tuli is the founder and CEO of Regionize. Unfortunately, her father passed away, so she couldn't attend today. I've been working hand in hand with Tuli for the past 7 years, and the social enterprise that we are hoping to become a sustainable business one day is focused on addressing crime and gender-based violence in South Africa. We manufacture and provide technology that allows the most vulnerable people in this country to, at a press of a button, call for help. We've developed South Africa's first public alarm system and work in partnership with community policing forums and SAPS to bring safety to those who live in the most vulnerable communities. And just to echo what some of the presenters has said, that I can mention through SAB Foundation in 2012, was the first funding that we received that facilitated the development of the alarm system that we have taken to market today.
Thanks so much, Almarie. Over to you, Nikki.
Yeah, thanks very much, Steve. So Spoon Money works in the informal sector. We basically target women-led informal businesses, and we provide a credit and savings solution to them. And we do this so that they can boost their businesses and be kind of transition from subsistence to more stable and hopefully sustainable enterprises. But it also allows us to be able to record and develop a credit history for them. And this in turn really helps their progress to become more financially included.
Thanks so much, Nikki. Over to you, Chad.
Thank you, Steve, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chad Robertson, and I'm the co-founder of Regionize. Regionize is a recycling solution that's on a mission to make recycling accessible, inclusive, and rewarding. We offer a freemium recycling collection service, as well as we work with the informal waste sector. So the reclaimers or waste pickers, we integrate them into our model and basically try and dignify their work to improve their earnings and to improve the way they operate. And then lastly, we also incentivize residents who perform the recycling collection with us with Rimali, which is a virtual currency we provide. And each time residents recycle and perform good sustainable behaviors, they earn some Rimali. Thank you.
Fantastic. 3 really awesome social enterprises. Almarie, Mameza has been around for close to 10 years, looking to protect communities and those that are vulnerable. Why has it been important to have a social issue at the core of your business model? And what are the benefits to having a social issue at that core?
Well, Steve, I think it's important to mention that Tuli was a repeat crime victim herself. And after her sister was attacked in Tembisa, she then decided to go on the social enterprise journey. So the whole reason behind that is because the market that we are trying to solve the problem for has affordability issues. Therefore, a normal business model would never have worked for us. I joined Tuli 7 years ago because I lost my sister due to gender-based violence. So the goal was to cater for those who have affordability issues, and we had to find a way to be able to cater for those through a non-profit organization, but still be able to sell to those who can afford through a normal business model. So bringing these two business models together have their benefits, because you can access CSI funding and enterprise development funding to cater for the specific needs of the market and your business, because you're manufacturing technology. But it also brings complications around the whole understanding of social enterprise, which we find a lot in the market with funders not understanding how these two organizations can work hand in hand to try and solve the problem.
That's great. And I think that emphasizes one of the findings and one of my initial comments, why it's so important that we find sort of this growth capital for social enterprises, because you're all solving the needs that you guys have all seen firsthand and addressing some of the most crucial issues that we see in our country. So what we also saw, and interesting about all your businesses, they all have a tech component to them. Nikki, why do you think tech has become such an instrumental part in the social enterprises toolkit in addressing social and environmental impact and creating and looking to create a sustainable commercial business model as well?
Yeah, Steve, listen, I mean, a social enterprise, like any other business, needs to work on the principles of efficiency and effectiveness, right? That's what technology allows us to do. It's kind of become a bedrock for lives. And so it just becomes, if you're with your clients and walking alongside your clients, it just has to inevitably become a tool in the business. So from the kind of the business of the business, it's effective, it's easy, it's cheaper, frankly, than people. So that all helps. But also what it does allow us to do is scale. If we're in the impact business, I think many of us actually want big impact. We don't necessarily want to, as wonderful as it might be to touch 1 or 2 lives, we hopefully are in the business of touching millions of lives, and technology allows us to do that. But also, frankly, if we want to become sustainable in what we do, we need to scale businesses. And scale allows us to get investment, which is a big part of what this discussion is about today. So technology, yeah, I mean, it's very much part of being with our clients. It's also a case of making the businesses efficient. And frankly, it makes us investable. So technology it really is a bedrock to what we have to do.
Yeah, and given the challenges that we're facing in South Africa and the scale of them, that makes sense. Chad, what have been some of the challenges that you've faced as a social entrepreneur, and specifically taking on a venture startup full time?
Thanks for the question, Steve. I guess this linking on the tech side, we came into existence from a tech angle, and we started out as the virtual currency, which is part of our business now. That was our business when we started out. And the reason why we created it was, there was a big issue in terms of recycling in South Africa. But again, from guys not being in the waste space or the recycling space, we came from the tech side, and we had the solution to, become don't hate me for this, but a Uber/Discovery Mile solution for recycling and sustainability. But when approaching the industry, we were quite hit back by the culture of the industry, which was our biggest challenge when we started out. Not being in the recycling space was a big culture shift for us. So here's 2 young guys, coming into trying to meet up with recycling companies and explaining the vision we have for South Africa in terms of recycling. And like I said, we were hit back with a lot of negativity, which kind of spurred us to get into the recycling space ourselves. And so besides the general challenges of starting your own business, the culture of the industry we faced was our first biggest challenge. And then, once we got into the industry ourselves, the next thing was funding. But I think we'll get into that a bit later.
Yeah, you have provided a great segue, because each of you have actually taken slightly different fundraising journeys. And I'd like to unpack that, because we saw in the findings that there is limited capital available to actually grow these businesses in our country, and certain instruments might not be appropriate for different business models. So let's unpack each of them. And maybe Chad, let's start with you. You've largely received money through grants and competitions up to this point, as far as I understand it. Firstly, why do you feel that you've been successful in that regard? And what have been some of the key points to your success, and why has that been appropriate up to this point in time?
Cool. Sure. So I think we've been successful because, we have a great vision as a company, and many people would like to see that scaled across South Africa. I think we also tick all the boxes for this competition. So we're environmentally and socially impactful, and our model is economically viable as well as innovative. And so I think it's been appropriate for us because we've been on a learning journey and adjusting the model as we're learning. So the current traditional landscape, which was spoken about much in the previous session, there wasn't really a space for us. When we went to VCs, they were very much about, they like the tech, but we also have this operational side to us because we're doing the actual work on the ground. So, that doesn't make it so attractive. And then going to the traditional funders who would traditionally fund the waste industry companies, they were very much focused on one specific KPI, or how much tons are you doing? And we were quite early stage, and so we never really found a space for ourselves. And so we found that the competitions were just less fussy. They looked at a different sort of categories, a different sort of KPIs compared to your traditional source of funding. And yeah, that was really why we focused on the competitions. And then, moving forward, we also plan to look at various other funds. But for now, this has been, until this part, it's been the greatest one for us to get to where we are now.
And tell me, Chad, have you looked at any international funders, and what were your experiences, if you have, around raising through the international market compared to the South African market?
Yeah, we're open to any sort of competition or fund that we tick the boxes in. Really, it's focused on our sector, and we recently won another competition that was internationally focused, but it has not been announced yet, so I can't say too much. But I think overall, it feels as though we're more valued when it comes to international funders as opposed to local funders. And at the stage you're working now, we do feel that to scale the model, the competitions and grant funds, won't be a sustainable way to get to that next model. And so we've started looking at, different sort of funds outside of South Africa as well that can help us to get to the next stage for the business.
Great, thanks, Chad, and all the best with that next sort of round that you're looking at. Nikki, you've taken a slightly different approach. What are the types of financing that what are they that you've raised, and why, and what are your sort of prospects going forward, and where are you looking to raise financing from?
Steve, yeah, listen, very early in Spoon's journey, we got a small equity investor, which was really amazing, because what they did was just literally back an idea. There was nothing to the business other than an idea. It is pretty small, but now for what feels now like a pretty chunky bit of equity, but I actually don't begrudge it, because it literally got us out of the starting blocks. And then we've also really focused a lot on grant funding and competitions. And the reason for that really is because we just, when you're in the space of kind of do this kind of product market fit, it's very experimental. And actually grant funding allows you to experiment. It's a kind of a low risk way of kind of finding the real business model, right? But because we're also in the world of credit, we have also got some loans. We've done some debt, and that's just been fairly traditional, debt funding, but fairly friendly debt funding, I will say. And that's also helped. And I think, so for us, as we look forward, certainly, we are looking at an equity partner. We think that's going to be critical for the business, also in terms of the kind of ambitions that we have for the business. But we also know that alongside that, we're always going to need kind of debt funding because of the nature of what we do. So we do see kind of, a kind of equity partner on the one hand to get the business going, and kind of debt funding on the other hand in order to support the loan book. And that's just the nature of what we do. So yeah, that's kind of where we've been at. And I mean, we've been very fortunate in some early debt actually came from friends and family, but it was debt and we had to pay it back, and we did. And so, and that's also kind of helped. But I think Chad's quite right about kind of global players just being more open to the notion of social enterprises. And that's quite an interesting debate for us to have.
Yeah, and I think you also highlighted a challenge that we saw come up around how expensive an equity raise at a very early stage can be, and some of the innovative financing tools that we've looked into and one of our colleagues has written about helps address some of those issues, because you want to enable the actual owner and the founder of these businesses also to retain some of that ownership and not sell off at a really expensive sort of price. But as you say, it was catalytic in terms of getting you to where you were and are right now. Finally, Almarie, what is your experience been like at Mameza raising financing to grow the business, and what are the types of financing you've considered and why?
So I think our journey sounds a lot like the other entrepreneurs. So winning competitions that supply grants to help grow the social enterprise has been great. We've had a great track record of that. As well as receiving support from government and some of our corporate partners, specifically in the startup and development phases. So that kind of grant funding we saw was enough to help us through the initial 4 to 5 years of the business and establishing the ground blocks. Internationally, we see some challenges at times because, for example, we were taken to Kuwait about 2 years ago with CEDA. Great funding opportunities were tabled there. And until today, we are still in the application process. It's 2 years later for that international funding. So having access to that, the right international funding, I think is become quite a challenge for us. Our second challenge is that, as I mentioned before, locally, our business models seem to not always make sense to some of the investors that we have approached. Some equity investors we have approached, some debt offerings we have approached, but haven't really gone for any of those because nothing could find a fit between wanting to make an impact and still grow the social enterprise. So we see when applying for funding outside of our current partners, funders don't understand really the business model and it kind of scares them. And they tend to lean more to the non-profit organization side and want to give us CSI funding and not to the business side where we can actually make sure that the whole social enterprise becomes sustainable. So we've never therefore been able to get debt funding through government because the social enterprise model doesn't work for them. The only debt funding that we were able to ever access was through the SAP Foundation program, which we are paying back diligently every month, Bridget. And our main challenge is still finding that ongoing sustainability, which needs an investor to come on board and help us scale and commercialize nationally with regards to the business side and not projects on the non-profit side.
Yeah, and I think Laura in the chat makes a good point that many social entrepreneurs have shied away from that more transactional investment because it is very focused on the ROIs, and that can also, whereas a social entrepreneur needs to balance the core element of their business in generating impact as well, right? So that sort of alignment, and that came up as a major finding in the study as well, in what social entrepreneurs are looking for from investors is that alignment with the impact mandate. And that market is still growing in South Africa, but it is growing. So we hope that it will continue to grow in size and number of impact investors involved in that as well. A major finding that I actually touched on in our presentation was that there seems to be a gender and racial gap still in the funding flows in South Africa. My understanding, and having co-convened impact investing course quite recently, is that there is a lot of attention and awareness around that, and investors are looking to put racial and gender lenses to their mandates. But Nikki, I'm interested in what is your opinion around the finding and how it's been addressed, and if you have any experiences around that as well.
Yeah, well, listen, it's unequivocally there's a bias, right? A negative bias to women, Black entrepreneurs. Let's just call it what it is. And so, but is there a lot of attention on it? Absolutely. I mean, certainly in the last year, it just feels both, well, and I'm going to say globally, because I'm not necessarily feeling it locally to the same extent, although certainly there is something like that, towards certainly investing in women, in women-founded businesses and women-run businesses, which I think is fantastic. So there is the gender issue is definitely being addressed. I think coming out of the States, probably more than anywhere else that I've seen so far, is this notion of, in fact, actually having this, looking at Black businesses, which I also think is fantastic. But Steve, overall, I mean, we know the continent has had probably its most successful funding year ever. And so are people investing in Black-run businesses on the continent? Absolutely. But yeah, so there's definitely an awareness around this. It does feel like it's being addressed. but it does feel like it's been a long time coming, I have to say. And I think the other layer to put on that is then impact investors. There's this kind of gender lens, there's this racial lens, and there's the impact bit on top of that. But fortunately, I also think there's greater attention in that space also.
Great, thanks so much, Nikki. Maybe just in closing, and this will go to let's do a quick 30 seconds from each of you, is what are the major bottlenecks and challenges you'd like to see addressed that could make social enterprise fundraising or the growth journey in South Africa easier, more effective, or streamlined? Let's start with you, Almarie, then we'll go to Chad, and then finally Nikki.
I think for us, Steve, the major bottleneck is still to get access to the market so that we can finally become 100% sustainable. So it's still about finding those partners and investors that has the appetite for investing in a social enterprise. Although we have proven we are here to stay, we've been around since 2012, we still struggle to get that partner that's willing to come in for the long run and become an equity investor or an investor on the PTY side that will help us grow. And that's our major, I think, bottleneck, specifically because we deal with the market with affordability issues. So we need to find a partner that can help us create innovative financial models to help that market access our product and eventually create the sustainability model, from our side.
Chad?
Cool. So yeah, I think from a growth perspective, just starting on that side, I think better collaboration is needed, especially from our side, working in the waste management industry. Collaboration with government and bigger businesses is quite important because it's one of those topics that, you don't just start a startup and you fix the problems. It needs a combination of parties to be involved. And, what we found is that there's a lot of people doing a lot of things on the sides and not working together. So I think collaboration is key. And then from a fundraising perspective, again, it really depends on which route you're going on. But again, from our experience in the recycling industry, there's a lot of money that's available in the industry, but that's mostly going towards traditional sort of things and not enough is going towards innovation. And so as an industry, I think there needs to be more money put on the table for innovation and new ways of thinking. And then, just based on the competition and grant spaces, I think those need to be more tailor-made because there's a lot of generic competitions happening. Yes, they give out money and funding, which is amazing, but I think they need to obviously also look at where each entrepreneur is at and tailor-make it to that because we can only go to so many business model canvas workshops.
That's quite funny, Chad. Steve, from my side, listen, we work with a segment that's very low income. And one of our single biggest bottlenecks is what we think of as the digital gap, actually. And this is about between us and our customers and our clients and the digital gap at the so-called bottom of the pyramid. And what I'm talking about here is, 40% of South Africans purportedly have, a smartphone. And I can tell you, because we've done the study, it's much lower where we operate. And that's because of the cost of them, but it's also because of the prohibitive cost of data. And frankly, the infrastructure, which needs to be addressed by government. If you have a smartphone and you have a rubbish network, you still don't have access. And that is a real, and it's a really real bottleneck. It's a bottleneck for social enterprises, and it's a bottleneck for a particular segment to be able to do things for themselves. So yeah, as much as we can talk about funding, and it's a real issue for certainly for social enterprises. There's some really real stuff that happens within our segment, and for me, that's my single biggest bugbear, is the so-called what we call the digital gap, which is, we talk about the poverty gap and we talk about an inequality gap. Well, let's all watch out for this digital gap because it's going to be exacerbating all of the above.
Thank you, all three of you, for joining today. Your insights have been incredible. Thank you for sharing your experiences as well. We really appreciate it, for both in the survey and today. We are going to touch on some of the questions that we haven't necessarily answered through typed responses. Maybe a quick first one, and it's for you, Almarie. Is Mameza available countrywide?
Yes, it is. We do have a national footprint. So yeah, we are available nationally.
Great. Fantastic. Bridget, I think you'd be best placed to answer the next one, and it's from Cheryl. And what Cheryl is asking, so given all the time constraints that social entrepreneurs sort of spend in addition to what they should do, what would your advice be to social impact investors to be more responsive to social entrepreneurs' needs?
Yeah, I think Chad's comment was a very valid one, in that I think that all of these guys, in order to get off the ground, have had to enter various competitions and get into multiple relationships with different funders. And I think the burden placed on them can be quite significant in terms of the expectations around them receiving that finance. And I think that, investors really need to be cognizant of the fact that if an entrepreneur already has a mentor or they're already on a program, don't force them to go and sit on another program. And ultimately, if you're really wanting to add value and grow this business, then it should be an engagement process between the entrepreneur and the investor, whatever that investor is, about what can they best do in order to assist the entrepreneur in that next growth stage. And it's a waste of money to force people to sit on multiple programs as well. So I think a lot more coordination between investors and really meeting the entrepreneur where they're at in terms of what they really need is really important.
Great. Thanks, Bridget. In the interest of time, I think we are going to have to wrap up now. You will see also Zach has left a link to the websites of each of our social entrepreneurs in the chat. So I'm sure that there's a way to contact them through that. Yeah, just thank you so much. Bridget, would you mind closing off with any thoughts that you have on the topic?
Thank you, Steve. I think for all of those attending and just listening to the three panelists and the issues you're trying to address and what is possible if your organizations are able to grow, I think it's just so encouraging to us, and I never cease to be amazed at the innovation that's coming out of this country. About 5 years ago, I went on a study tour to Israel with Investec, where we went to look at their social enterprise infrastructure there. And what really struck me is Israel is held up as being Palestine, whichever one you choose, is held up as being this real heart of innovation in the world. And so I don't know what my expectations were, but what I discovered when I was over there and I listened to a lot of the stories is that our innovation in South Africa is world class. I mean, what is coming out of this country is truly remarkable. But what really struck me there was I said to some of the innovators, if you have a solution that can really improve government service delivery, what do you do about that? And their answer to me was, well, it's a no-brainer. If it's going to improve government efficiency, government adopts it. That's just the way things are. Government just takes it on. And I think, in our country, with all of our issues, we have to create a more enabling environment for this innovation to grow and to assist entrepreneurs get through these early stages. So I think that this research really starts that conversation, and I really hope that it's a conversation that leads to action. So I just wanted to say thank you to all of you. Thank you very much to you guys who put the research together for us. It was a really important piece of work to do, and I'm very grateful that we've done it. And yeah, thanks very much to our panelists as well for giving us your time, and congratulations on the work that you're doing, and just thank you for everything that you're doing.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Bridget. And thank you everyone for joining us. And we hope that you have a lovely day further and stay safe.
Bye.